Hey everybody, today I'm talking about the best camera settings, in my opinion, for sports photography. Let's get into it. Hey everybody, before we get started on the subject at hand, the camera settings, I'd like to invite everybody who would like their photos reviewed by me in an upcoming video, send them in to me. You want to send them to photo review, all one word, photo review at proton, proton.me, photo review at proton.me, and perhaps I'll use it in an upcoming video. Now with that said, let's get going on the meat of the matter. Now, the first thing I would talk about is mechanical versus electronic shutters. And if you have a DSLR, this doesn't really apply to you, but hang with me because we'll get through this as quickly as possible. But if you're using a mirrorless camera, this very much will apply to you. So most mirrorless cameras have either a mechanical or an electronic shutter, or actually a combination of both. Now, what's the difference between a mechanical and electronic shutter? Well, mechanical is like old-style shutters. It's actually physical leaves that move up and down with the speed of the shutter and exposes the sensor as it moves up and down. It creates a gap, and that exposes the sensor. An electronic shutter is different in that it scans across the face of the sensor. Now, a lot of older mirrorless cameras have both, and you can make a choice between the two of them, whether you use electronic or whether you use mechanical, and some of them will let you automate it. Now, the camera I'm using to demonstrate today only has an electronic, doesn't have a mechanical. But if you have a choice, when it comes to sports photography, I would suggest a mechanical shutter. The reason being is it prevents rolling shutter. Rolling shutter is what happens as it's scanned across the face of the sensor. If you have an object that's moving through the image, for example, a bat of a baseball player, it actually will cause that bat to appear warped. Here's an example right here. It's an airplane, engines running with a mechanical shutter. It actually could freeze the slower moving propeller. On the other side, next to it in the image right next to it, that's an electronic shutter, and you can see the rolling shutter. The blades of the propeller actually appear bent. So obviously that's something you don't want in your sports images. So it can happen with anything that's moving very rapidly through space. You know, it could be a ball, a bat, something along those lines. So if you have a choice between the two, you might want to consider just setting mechanical shutter. Now for the rest of these settings, I'm demonstrating on a Nikon camera, but really I'm going to make this generic enough so it applies to any camera that's out there today, no matter what the manufacturer is. The terms may be a little different, but all the concepts are there. They just may call it something slightly different, but you'll get the gist of it as we go through it. The first thing I want to talk about is frame rate. You definitely want to set your camera to the highest frame rate it possibly has. It all varies based on the make and model of the camera. You know, it could be anywhere from, say, 5 frames per second for a lower end camera up to 120, 240 frames per second, believe it or not. And in my case, I set it on 20 frames per second. But again, your camera may be different. It may not go to 20, maybe go higher. But I have found 15 to 20 is kind of a sweet spot for most sports photography that I do. The next thing I want to talk about is what I call back button focus. If you've never done a back button focus before, I suggest you try it. Some cameras have a dedicated button on the back that may say AF on, that basically what you're doing is you're separating the function of focusing from the actual firing of the shutter. I prefer it. In my experience, it helps me control my firing, it helps me control my framing, it helps me control my autofocus much better than when it was sitting on the shutter button itself. If you haven't tried it, I would say at least give it a try. Now, you may not have a button that's dedicated that says AF on or something to that effect. But you may have the ability to set a button that's on the back of your camera to perform that same function. Again, it all depends on make and model of the camera. Look at your particular camera and the manual associated with it to see if you have that capability. So the next thing I want to talk about is modes. What I mean by modes are, is it manual? Is it in program? Is it an aperture value or aperture priority? Is it in shutter value or shutter priority? And some of you may have like a little button that says sport. This is my recommendation to you. First of all, avoid program and avoid sport if you have those. The reason being is the camera is going to try to take a photo as best it can based on the circumstances at hand, but it may not know. And even in the sport mode, it probably will be producing shutter speeds way too low for you to capture good action, unless it is nice and bright out. Once it starts to get dark, probably that program mode and that sport mode are not going to work for you, and you're going to get blurry photos. I'm going to tell you is I prefer manual mode. Manual mode, in my case, what I mean by that is I set the shutter speed, I set the aperture, and then I will let the camera go to auto ISO. So those are the three factors you need to worry about: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Shutter speed for me, my base value for sports is a thousandth of a second. That is like the starting point. Can I go lower than that? Maybe. And if it's a really super dark situation and I don't have a lens that opens up to a wider aperture and I'm worried about how high my ISOs are going, yeah, I might go to a lower level. But to me, for sports, and I'm talking sports down to kid level, I prefer a thousandth of a second because in general, that does a good job of stopping action. It'll stop most hand movement, it'll stop most foot movement. Once you start dropping down below a thousandth of a second, 800, 640, 500, you'll start to see, especially in the feet and the hands, more blur from their movement, especially down around 500th of a second. I know there are people out there on YouTube saying you should shoot at 500th of a second. To me, shooting at 500th of a second is an emergency situation where it is so dark that I have no other choice. I'm going to tell you, for your own benefit, start with a thousandth of a second and then go up from there. Now, I wouldn't leave it on that. If it's a nice, bright, sunny day and I have a lens that say opens up to f2.8, it'll probably go to 2,000, maybe 3,000. For baseball, I like to shoot at 4 thousandths of a second so it stops the balls, it stops the bat. But 1,000 is like, think of it as your baseline for sports photography. As far as aperture is concerned, because we're talking about manual aperture, whatever lens you're using, I prefer to use it wide open. And why do I shoot wide open? Because I'm trying to create separation with my subject from my background. The wider your aperture, it creates less depth of field, and your background tends to be more out of focus. In fact, with very large lenses, say 300, 400, if you're shooting at, say, f2.8, which is pretty wide open, you'll get a very nice, smooth, creamy background that your subject, which is nice and sharp and in focus, will appear to just pop out of. It'll have a more 3D effect. Otherwise, if you use smaller apertures, what you tend to have is more cluttered backgrounds. And then the background tends to start to overpower your main subject. So shoot as wide open as you possibly can. Now, I said I like to use auto ISO. And generally, I use it all the time. Day, night, doesn't really matter. ISO can float, and I'm willing to let it float. Now, is it foolproof? No, it's not foolproof. Sometimes the camera's metering system is thrown off a little bit, and you may have to use compensation. So what I'll do is I'll take a few photos, see how they're doing with the auto ISO. If I think it needs to be adjusted, I'll use what's called compensation, the compensation button, which on this particular camera is on top, and I can make compensation either plus or minus. So basically, I'm telling the camera I want you a little overexposed or I want you a little underexposed. And generally that happens when I have a subject that's very brightly lit, an extremely dark background, or vice versa. I have a subject that's in shadow, but the background is extremely well lit. That tends to throw off the metering system. Now that we're talking about metering systems, I like to use what Nikon calls matrix metering. I've heard it also called evaluative metering and other camera models. Center weighted, I don't use. Spot metering, I don't use. Highlight weighted, I don't use. I have heard people say to use spot metering for sports. I disagree. I use matrix. Now, the reason I don't use spot metering is because what I have found is the spot meter, which just meters off a very small part of the very center of the frame, tends to be thrown off by uniforms. So say you have two teams playing each other. Usually one team is wearing very dark colors. One team is wearing white, usually. So when I'm photographing a team that's in white, the meter gets thrown off because it's seeing, it wants to underexpose because it's seeing all that white. It's trying to bring it down to 18% gray. Meanwhile, if I switch to a player that's wearing very dark colors, guess what? The camera wants to bring it up to 18% gray, or what it's called middle gray, so it tends to overexpose it. When I use matrix, or what other camera manufacturers call evaluative, it tends to even things out better. Again, it can be thrown off, and that's why I use the compensation button, but in the end, in general, evaluative or matrix metering for Nikon seems to work the best for me. All right, now let's get to what format are we going to shoot in, either RAW or JPEG. My personal opinion is RAW. Now, if you looked at some of my earlier videos, I really pushed JPEG. The reason I pushed JPEG years ago is because at that time, the noise reduction, in-camera noise reduction, was better for JPEG than what we were getting in our photo editors by using RAW and then trying to clean up the noise reduction in post in, say, Lightroom. The noise reduction process in Lightroom sucked. Now it's not true anymore. Now, with RAW images, you can get very clean, noise-free images that are superior to JPEG. Now, there's still time and place for JPEG. If you're first starting out and learning the system, JPEG is probably the way to go because you don't know how to edit yet. However, I would suggest that once you get to the point where you're learning how to edit, switch to RAW. There's so many benefits associated with shooting RAW over JPEG. It's much easier to edit. It has a much greater dynamic range. You can affect colors much easier. You can adjust white balance much better, which we'll get to here in a second. Overall, it produces better images, in my opinion, than JPEG. And once again, with the noise reduction software that's out there today, my personal favorite right now is DxO Pure RAW 4. With that type of software, it really cleans up noise very well, far superior to what modern cameras can do in camera with JPEG. So in my opinion, shoot RAW when you can. All right, next up, let's talk about white balance. Now, for the most part, I like to use auto white balance for the most part. If it's a nice, bright, sunny day, yeah, I'll put it on direct sunlight and the camera meter for direct sunlight, which is great. It works fine. If it's cloudy, yeah, I can switch it to cloudy. If my subject's in the shade, yeah, I can put it on shade, and yada, 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 incandescent fluorescent. However, what I have found is once the sun starts to go down, or you're indoors, or things keep changing, you know, the sun's going down, now you're starting to get shadows, or you got cloud cover that comes and goes. In those types of situations, I might just want to go to natural light auto, or in this case, auto. I like to set it for auto, keep white. Your camera may be a little different, but auto seems to work pretty darn good. The only time I ever use these other ones is when I know for sure what the color temperature is inside. It's usually inside a building. But I would tell you most of the time, indoors, auto white balance works fine. And again, because I'm shooting RAW, I can usually adjust it pretty easily in post in my photo editor. Okay, next up, we're going to talk picture controls. Picture controls are only affected by if you're shooting JPEG. But basically what's happening is the camera is applying one of these kind of picture controls to it. In this model, it could be the auto, standard, neutral, vivid. You can shoot in monochrome, which is black and white. You could do portrait, rich tone portrait, landscape, flat. But as I said, all of these only work with JPEG. You can apply them with RAW, and if you take it into the Nikon's RAW editor, NetX Studio, it'll apply these adjustments to it, to that RAW image. But once again, this is only for a JPEG thing. If you are going to shoot JPEG, I would just leave it at standard, or, you know, you can make the case for putting it in flat, which creates a more raw-like image that you have greater latitude in editing. But if you just want stuff straight out of the camera, I just put it in standard and go with it. So let's talk about noise reduction. And once again, this only affects JPEGs because they are processed by the camera. So for high ISO noise reduction, it depends on the camera. You know, you're gonna have to experiment a little bit with the images you're shooting, where you're shooting, the lighting conditions, how bad the noise is. And it will vary based on that. Since I almost never shoot JPEG, I set it on high, but again, you're gonna have to experiment a little bit with your camera and seeing what works best. But if you're gonna vary in very dark situations and your ISO is very high, I would just set it on high and go for it. So the next thing I want to talk about is photo flicker reduction. And I recommend you turn it on. Just leave it on, turn it on, leave it on all the time. So what happens is lights cycle. And what they tend to do is they cycle in different frequencies depending on the type of light. What happens is when you put it on flicker reduction is the camera will detect that flickering, which you may not be able to see with your own eye, you probably won't, and it adjusts for it. Is it a perfect system? No, it is not perfect. I've been in situations where I have varying lighting sources that are just all over the map, usually in very old gyms or very old fields. And what will happen is the camera may adjust for one area, but it'll be thrown off by something else. Again, this is another reason you might want to shoot in RAW, because it gives you more latitude to fix those types of things. But in my opinion, put on photo flicker reduction, leave it on. It's not going to affect your images in daylight and with good, standard lighting. It's not going to affect it at all. I have heard some people claim that it actually slows your camera down. I have never experienced that. I have never seen that, but there are people out there who will say that, and there are people who will say it in the comments below. But I have never experienced it. Maybe it happened on older camera models years ago, but newer models, I don't see it. I never see it. So put it on, leave it on. Don't stress about it. All right, next up is vibration reduction. Well, there's two types of vibration reduction. There's in-camera vibration reduction, which not all cameras have, and then there's lens vibration reduction. Each manufacturer calls it something different. Nikon calls it VR, vibration reduction. I think Canon is IS. I've heard it called OS, depending on the manufacturer, but you get the point. What it does is it helps reduce camera movement, and it does it by actually moving the sensor slightly, ever so slightly, extremely fast, based on the vibration it's feeling. There's also lens vibration reduction. Now, there was a time in the past where I used to say I didn't use it. And it was mostly because I was using older lenses and I could feel it and it was buzzing, depending on how old the lens was, and it would work all the time. It was really annoying to me. And with higher shutter speeds, it's not as big a factor. However, with newer lenses, the newer models that are coming out, I turn it on, I leave it on, I don't even know it's happening. I can't actually feel the vibration in the lens itself. So now with newer lenses, I turn it on. So I would say if you have that option, either on the lens or the camera or both, I would say turn it on, leave it on, go for it. Now finally, let's talk about autofocus modes. My preference is autofocus continuous when it comes to sports photography, which means as long as I'm pressing down on the button, it'll continue to try to focus. You can have it autofocus single, where it'll lock in focus and then it'll stop. Or you could, of course, have manual focus, which I never touch when it comes to sports photography. And this is why I like to use the back button, as I talked about before, is I control it. I don't need an AFS or an autofocus single because I can control the autofocus continuous. As far as autofocus area mode, now this is a Z9 and it's got a lot of different options. Pinpoint autofocus, single point, which is a very small spot. Dynamic area, which is kind of a grouping. 3D tracking, where it tries to do eye detection or face detection, will track it all over the entire sensor itself. Auto area autofocus, where the camera does all the work for you, which I do not recommend. This is wide area small. This is my particular preference. I like to put that box right on somebody's face or their head and track them in there. And what will happen is anything that's in that box itself, we'll try to find a face or a head or eyes. The closer you are, the better it is at picking up the eyes. This same sort of functionality is present in a lot of mirrorless cameras today. If you have something on your camera that does something like this, I recommend it. All right, everybody, I hope this helps you out in setting up your camera for sports photography, no matter what brand you use. Remember, some of the terms I use may be a little different with your manufacturer. That's fine. Pull out your handbook, go through it, and you see something that sounds like it's doing the same thing that I just described, maybe use a little bit different terms, explore with it, play with it, try it out. Once again, if you'd like photos reviewed, check me out. Send me an email with a couple images, complete edited images to photo review, all one word, at proton.me. In the meantime, if you got something out of this video, please hit that like and the subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. And I will see you in the next video.